Well, welcome to this Resilience First webinar, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who viewed the opening video, I hope you gained an insight on our organisation. I'm Robert Hall, and standing in for our chairman, Simon Collins, who went ill last night, probably with the virus. He apologises and sends his best wishes in these rather unusual times. Resilience First was created only 21 months ago to help build resilience in business communities, whether that be communities defined by geography or special interest. Since its inception, we have attracted 14 major companies as champions and a host of affiliated bodies and members for our network. They are all willing to spread the word through best practices and learnings. There is nothing quite like a crisis to reinforce the need for resilience, and the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the value of personal resilience, organisational resilience, communal resilience, and national resilience. And the key to being resilient is people and communities. And this particular crisis, one which leaves systems and processes largely untouched, is one which tests our collective resolve. So the theme for the next hour is the coronavirus outbreak and resilient communities. And we're delighted to have with us two top experts to take us through two different aspects of the pandemic. I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Simpson, who is Head of Emergency Response Department and Deputy Director of the Health Protection Directorate at Public Health England. I'm sure you want to extend my thanks to John for taking time out of what must be a mind-spinning job at the moment, and he has very kindly stood in for our previous speaker. John will speak first and give us an update on the fight against the virus as it affects business, but as he has to leave early, we will pause after he speaks, take a few questions if you wish to email them in. Our second but no less qualified speaker is Jean Devlin, who is partner in global risk analysis at Control Risks. Jean will be addressing the economic and security aspects of the pandemic. Now, the biographies for both speakers have been circulated this morning by email. So I hope you've seen those, and I won't bother to repeat, but only to introduce. Finally, I will remind participants that they can ask questions throughout the session by typing a message, which I can see, and at the end I will pick up the common themes and put those to the speakers. You will not be able to speak, I'm afraid. So without further ado, I'll pass across to John, and again offer my thanks for taking time out in a very busy time. So John, over to you. John, can you hear us?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh,
thank
sorry.
you. My heart was stopping there.
Yeah, sorry, I am very old. I'm not occasionally not good with technology. Thanks. I'll be as brief as possible. Have you got my slides up, or do I need to share them?
No,
I'm doing that now. It's up now.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll whip through these because it might be more helpful if people can ask questions. Really. So that's my sort of title. If you'd like, next slide. Just to say that respiratory virus outbreaks have been a significant issue through the last, well, since the beginning of time, really. And these are a few from the 20th century. And this is why an influenza pandemic has always been the highest priority and the highest impact point on the Cabinet Office's resilience framework and in the public. So it's something that, from an influenza point of view, there's always been a lot of planning about. I'm sure in your businesses you've done the same. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, if we just go, obviously one thing about COVID-19 is the issues that, from our point of view, is the issues that international and within national travel have caused, and particularly of interest to us has been some of the issues with respect to cruise ships, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. And from a business point of view, I imagine you're probably thinking about how this may affect your businesses in the future, and not just people who are in the travel industry. If you next slide, please. I'll just this is just as you probably all know, this virus originated from a wet market in China, and basically what most coronaviruses do is that they emerge in one species and go to another. And there there may well be intermediate hosts between that, because coronaviruses are not human specific. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you just go to the next one? This is what a coronavirus looks like. The right-hand picture is the present strain in the UK on electron microscopy with false colour. It's basically an RNA, what's called an RNA virus, and it's called coronavirus because it looks like a crown. And it's basically a moderately sized virus. Next slide, thanks. So there has been a very large public health response, as you know, worldwide. And there's been, the WHO have been issuing guidance and did declare a pandemic a few weeks ago, which meant that various sort of international legal actions could be taken. And also one of the reasons the UK government has made various statements is because it affects some of the legal actions that we can take. Next slide. So I just thought you might be interested in some of the epidemiology from today. This is number of cases, not percentage, but it probably shows you nothing you don't know already, which is that the coronavirus started in China, and there still obviously have been a lot of cases in China, although they've slowed down, and has moved particularly to Western European countries, and now to the United States and North America. It has so far spared South America and Africa, and although it's not known whether that will continue and whether it's whether the so far low incidence there is due to other factors. As of today, Public Health England have tested. There's been 73,576 tests done. There are 6,843 cases in England, with an overnight change of 1,258, and the data we have on deaths is 386 in the UK. And these are people who have died and have been tested positive for coronavirus. One issue we have in some of the international figures is that some of the definitions still vary, particularly on deaths, and so cannot be sometimes directly comparable. Could I have the next slide? This is some just daily incidences in countries. They're not on the same scale, but the top is China, and as you see, the outbreak was going up exponentially, but has now tailed off. Bottom left is Italy, where we're still seeing an exponential rise. However, there is a possibility that we met that in Italy, they may be getting to the top of the bell curve of distribution. Spain has been rising quickly, and we have figures there for Iran. The UK obviously has fewer numbers than Spain, than Spain or Italy. We're at 7,000. And what all the issues, what social isolation and all the issues the government has been putting in place to do is to try and flatten the curve to put less pressure on health services, and hopefully reduce the amount of illness and death in the population. Come next slide, please. As you know, the government has been had a very large media and campaign of producing guidance, and also producing guidance for sectors. Something over the last 2 days I've been personally very involved in one or two sectors. And this is all being put onto gov.uk, and we know businesses are using it because they contact us all the time, which is good, and about clarifications. Next slide, please. This is the government phases. It's probably and we're sort of going from delay into mitigation now. One thing at the bottom is research. One major push in the UK and other countries is the development of a vaccine. Coronavirus is unusual, unfortunately, in that it's a new virus, and there's no pre-existing vaccine, and so the amount of work needed to produce a vaccine scientifically is very large, but that is going on quite well at the moment, and hopefully people are working very hard in lots of places to try and expedite a vaccine and get it into the clinical trials phase quickly. Go to the next slide. As I say, this is our update. This dashboard is publicly available, and you see it shows the cases and the UK cases rising. And what we want to try and do is to flatten that curve, as I say, to protect health. And what would be ideal is to be able to keep the curve reasonably flat till we get a vaccine, if that is at all possible. Next slide, please. One of the interesting things about this, about coronavirus, and this is of relevance to business, is the fact that it does affect the genders differently. It seems to have a particular predilection for males, particularly over the age of 70, and also the death rate and the serious illness rate is highest in males over the age of 70 and even higher over 80. But for some of us, it is slightly higher for over 60s, which has a personal impact to me. Next slide, please. So this is the guidance page, and I'm sure all of you are now very familiar with it. The guidance is updated quite regularly, which is I don't want to say, but it is a major piece of work for Public Health England and some of our partner agencies to do this. And we try and update this and get it through the clearances needed as fast as possible. As I say, we for instance, will be published. There's guidance for the food industry that's coming out today. Next slide. And obviously, one thing that is really affecting business is social distancing and exclusion times. And I've talked to various businesses personally about issues. And one thing it is triggering, obviously, is increased amounts of home working, of use of remote access. We're doing it ourselves as much as we can. And it means a lot of businesses are having to change their business models very, very quickly. And we understand the pressure that puts people under. Next slide, please. So you know the messages. I think I'll leave that, and about social distancing. Next. I can't stress washing hands enough, and nobody can. It does seem that spread of this virus is is particularly strong on hands and putting hands to the mouth, and not just purely from coughing and an airborne droplet spread in the air. And so hand washing for 20 seconds is incredibly important. And if there are, it is very important to stress this to staff. Over. Sorry, next slide, please. And obviously this is about coughing and sneezing, and that's fairly evident. Next slide. And one thing is about face masks, which are not recommended as an effective means of preventing the spread of infection. They're important in clinical settings, but all the evidence we have is that there is very little evidence of benefit of people using them outside. And obviously people getting them and using them outside reduces the amounts that are available for clinical settings. Next slide. And this is about how to seek medical advice, which you can get from the websites. Next slide. And one thing that we're looking and doing, there's a lot of work going on, is for the well-being of people who are staying at home and self-isolating and working from home. We're particularly for people with children, and there's a lot of social marketing going on about things that people can do, and this is an important thing for businesses to help with this, about keeping staff going at home, but also on people's mental well-being, because one of the concerns is as if people are staying at home, working at home, perhaps on their own, that being able to check their mental well-being is important. Next slide. And then that's just on self-isolation. I think that's my last slide. So I think I've gone over my 10 minutes, but I'm very happy to take some questions and things, anything that anybody wants. Over.
John, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to. I hope there's. Sorry if there's an echo on the line. I'd like to raise some questions that people have sent in, and perhaps you could address those. I'll raise a number of them, and then you can pick your way through whichever you prefer. The first question is what do you see as the end game here, both in terms of time, because it's been varied from weeks to years, and resilience in any second wave. And one question from a participant here is asked about Russia. Do you think that the lack of information, skepticism on Russia's reported cases is going to cause a second outbreak? So could I ask you to address the questions about the duration and way this is going to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, it could evolve in various ways. It could be that our social distancing and other measures mean that we get an exponential rise, which puts huge pressure on the health services, which you're seeing in Italy. That will work through the population, and the modelling really shows that the sort of peak period for this is probably, in a sense, something like, if it was allowed to just run its course as it would have, without any distancing or any work to try and stop it, it would happen over about a 16 to 20 week period. If we can flatten the curve, it will last longer, but there will be less stress. It'll still be extreme stress, but there will be less stress on health and social care services. And this is where you get a lot of the 3 months type discussion. If that's the case, then this should a wave. We would be probably looking at it certainly beginning to go down in late May, June. And one thing we will have very soon is what's called serology, which is where you can test people to see if they've actually had the virus. and that's going to be quite important. And you've seen this where you have, if you could test a large enough proportion of the population with serology, it gives you an idea of how many people, well, it gives you an extremely good idea of how many people, A, have had the disease, and B, how many people who are getting the disease are actually becoming ill. We can put things into models, but once we know, we have a much better idea. There is a thought that in Italy, the social distancing they have put in is possibly now flattening their curve. And obviously in some countries in Southeast Asia, it does seem to have done that. So tentatively, we may say that social distancing may have an effect on this virus, and we'll be looking at seeing if we see that in the UK within the next few weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Shall I answer the other two questions? One,
yeah.
Very quickly. A second wave, the most thoughts are a second wave might happen in this particular virus. One of the risks would be if you flatten it too quickly, this is counterintuitive, you may get a second wave because you still have enough susceptibles if you haven't got a vaccine. So in countries such as China, that might just be an issue, and that wave would happen in the autumn, early winter, which obviously puts pressure on health services, and that's one of the things in the UK we want to prevent, obviously. And on Russia, well, I don't want to start a diplomatic incident. The figures from Russia don't seem very good or plausible, and I'll just leave it at that.
Very diplomatic, thank you. Another question is, there have been a variety of responses from different countries. What does that tell us? Firstly, about the state of global governance, and secondly, what can we learn from different responses that may help us in the future?
Yeah, I think that's an extremely good question, actually. There have been different responses, although they've not been entirely different. One of the things about this is timing of social distancing, because one is, in some countries they put in social distancing very really quite early. In other countries it's been put in rather later, and some of this is due to what you might call social or sociological issues, is that certain countries may historically have different ways of dealing with this and have different ways of dealing with their society and organising their society, and some of the measures are much more acceptable to populations. The other thing is as I say, on timing, in that if you're going to ask people to do social distancing for 12 weeks, certainly in a Western liberal democracy, you've got to explain it to them very carefully, because what you're doing is in a sense taking away some of their liberty, and so this is a decision obviously for politicians. It's not for advisors, but that some of that may vary with particularly where, and also effects on health service. So there are a lot of parameters in this, but what it says about global governance is the World Health Organization can advise people to do things, but it can't ever tell anybody to do anything. And so I think one thing is I think one learning point I think from this will be actually for countries to come together more earlier and work out a consensus as to what happens within the way they organise their own social and political systems. That may sound a rather grand answer, but I think it probably is something that will come out of this. Over.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. Turn it to a very practical question now, one that's hitting the headlines in the last 24 hours, about the construction industry.
Yes.
Could you comment on this issue about subcontractors and non-essential construction projects, and how they may threaten bigger contractors in terms of trying to make this 2-meter rule possible? I know it's very, very topical at the moment.
Yeah, there is going to be guidance on the construction industry coming out either today or tomorrow about this. And it's obviously we're not, we just advise on the health side of it. But one thing that does, and I think it's a very good, is does concern me, and it has been picked up from discussions that have been happening, is the fact that actually, if you want construction to continue, you've got to have the supply chain of materials. And actually, from a health point of view, that's very important, because if a hospital has a problem and you can't get the parts to fix it, that's a big issue in this sort of situation. So that's all been taken into account in the guidance, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I turn to another question about face masks? And I think we all have gotten from both PHE and WHO that face masks are not effective outside. But the reality is we're seeing more and more of it. And particularly in a cultural context, you just need to look at pictures from around the world that the majority of people in Japan or China are wearing face masks. So while your PHE advice is not to, how do you deal with the reality of the fact that people will feel some or gain some reassurance from wearing a mask, and what advice are you giving to people to say, well, if you do wear one, this is what you need to do?
I think, as I say, our advice is that, and WHO advice is that face masks are not a useful intervention in the general public. As I say, one of the issues I think in all countries is if people are wearing face masks in public when they don't need them, that's taking away. If it's a surgical mask, or even I've seen people with FFP3 respirators, masks, then you're taking. They're not there to be used for in a healthcare context where they're actually needed. I think the issue here, again, is in the sense that there's an element of culture here. In Japan, people have always worn face masks for years, and that's part of a cultural thing of not wishing to infect others. It's not to protect themselves. It's a wish not to infect others, and I think that's that's an interesting point. So there's cultural differences. As I say, our view is not. The other thing I would say about face masks, and when I was young and was a real doctor, on public health, I'm a real doctor, but is I don't know if anybody has tried wearing a surgical face mask for 5 hours. I can tell you it's not terribly pleasant. And I think the other thing is that for some people it may actually be have issues. So I think one thing is that I think that is one of the other things is how much people can in a way tolerate this, something which actually there really is good evidence to say if there is any effect at all of this, it's absolutely minimal, and it takes away from other sectors where you do need them.
One last question. I have many to scribe through, but this one last one. We know, or we assume that from advice, that after 72 hours, the virus dies on hard surfaces.
Yes.
Is it therefore not reasonable to effectively wait for 72 hours rather than have or undergo a very expensive deep clean of a building, or insist that people wear full PPE? We just sort of sit back and wait for the virus to die, if that's possible within office context.
Yeah, well, we've put guidance out about cleaning, and I don't think we are suggesting people do deep cleans. Yes, the virus itself on hard surfaces doesn't, and in fact, 72 hours is giving a margin of error. Actually, it probably doesn't last even that long. And there's now research on that on hard surfaces of good quality. It is best to clean. Well, it's best to clean surface anyway, but it is best to clean this off, because once you've cleaned, then you can use the facility immediately. One thing is that, and it's in, as I say, I refer to the I think it's the guidance on cleaning non-healthcare premises. it just means you can get back faster. I mean, you could, in a sense, it would be possible to leave for 72 hours, but because of as long as cleaners are wearing the right PPE, the risk isn't really absolutely minimal, if at all, and actually it gets your facility back operational, because virtually all normal cleaning will get rid of this virus, and certainly the sort of materials are used by commercial cleaners in offices will kill the virus anyway.
John, I must draw it to a close there. I'm conscious that you also have to depart, so may I thank on behalf of everybody listening very much for your time and your professional advice to the questions, and wish you well and stay safe and continue your good work. So thank you indeed. If you can continue listening, that would be great. But I'll move. Oh, well, one question is, can we share your slides at the end of all this, if that's possible?
Yes, that's fine.
That's very kind. I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me move on to our second speaker now, Jean Devlin from Control Risks. Jean, are you there?
Yep.
Please take it away, as it were.
Great, thanks, Robert. So first, I would like to say it's a pleasure to be with you all on the line, if not in person. I hope everybody's well, and it was great to hear John's insights there. And thank you very much, Robert and Bina, for convening us all. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the situation in terms of implications for business and looking at the economic impacts as well as other impacts that businesses are experiencing. I just want to check that my slides are
They're there.
up.
Yeah.
Do I need to push anything, Bina, or?
It's there. Do you want me to start it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
You can just go to the covering slide. Great. So I just want to make a couple of points up front to set the scene. The first one being, obviously, this is a public health crisis. It's not like other either economic crises or other types of crises that businesses and organizations will plan for and have a crisis response plan to manage through. So it's more, the business disruption is really more akin to a kind of natural disaster in terms of how it's impacting on businesses, but also on countries and communities, rather than other types of shocks, such as a data breach, for example, or a terror attack. The impacts across different communities are, of course, going to vary depending on how significant the health impact is, but also the repercussions of shutting down normal daily life vary by location. So even just at a very simplistic level, the shutdown of, I was on the phone with a client yesterday, major global miner, who's concerned that they have been told in a very knee-jerk fashion to shut down, the only kind of economic activity in a very remote part of a developing country, which is generating a lot of security issues around the site itself, as well as backlash against both the government and the company. So countries are kind of learning how to enact these measures, but the implications on local communities are very hugely and can be extremely severe in terms of the economic impacts, as well as the social impacts and security issues that it's generating as well. So those come into play in different ways in different geographies. I think the common point that I would make is that communities that have been hit more recently by other types of shocks, so for example, the floods in Northern England, or that are already vulnerable due to the other structural factors, are likely to see longer term impacts and be harder hit, broadly speaking, regardless of where we are in the world. The second key point I'd like to make up front is that obviously the measures that governments can take are different compared to any other type of crises. And as we've seen in the UK as well as elsewhere, these measures are really unprecedented in nature as well as in scale. For businesses, I think a lot of businesses are thinking in a similar way about taking, measures that they would not otherwise have usually in their crisis response and crisis management toolkit. I think the big unknown is really that we don't really know when we will be returning to business as usual, or if we will be returning to business as usual. So there's a lot of talk at the moment that businesses in China are gearing up for some kind of recovery phase, but we can't really be certain because, as John has kind of walked us through in a lot more detail, the virus itself, we don't really know how it will respond, and may respond differently in parts of the world given the public health measures that have been taken. So I think the key message for businesses is we're not really going back to business as usual. We may be going to a new normal. We're calling it the non-normal because it probably won't be, a lot of things won't look very familiar to how they did before. And I think for businesses, particularly large multinational businesses, thinking about the impact that you can have in the communities in which you are a stakeholder and often a key player is really kind of looking at what that local impact can be and what your group priorities are as a business. So I think having a program around community resilience, the companies who have got that in place and are working on that at the moment, recovery and tailoring that recovery to their local presence is a key part of their thinking. Then the final broad point I want to make, and I think this came up in the questions already, is about global coordination and leadership and the role of the political leaders in this front. So at the end of last year, at Control Risk, every year we put out kind of our key themes for the year ahead, and one of those themes was the fact that we have a lot of political leaders who are really operating much more tactically rather than strategically, and that focus of that proliferation of leaders focused on a more tactical response means that for business it's much more challenging when small issues can escalate quite quickly and become much more significant, because we don't have those channels for international communication, de-escalation and resolution of crises. I think the measures that we've seen in the UK have and across the G7 countries, there is an aspect certainly of global coordination on that front. And I think this morning there's a meeting among the G20 leaders to try to enhance and improve that international coordination. But again, this has really shed quite harsh light on the state of global political leadership, both in terms of that lack of a strategy as well as the lack of international channels for coming together in a crisis such as this. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Yeah. So getting into the scenarios that we have developed for the business, political, social impacts, and a lot of these obviously are also looking at the economic factors. We started looking at this in February, so out of the situation in China and looking at how it would affect kind of global business. The first scenario on there, quick recovery, I think has, it still seemed plausible back in February. It's obviously now quite redundant. That's just not happened with the passing of events. The key impacts through all of these scenarios are things like global value change, the fact that businesses and manufacturers of medical equipment in particular, but all sorts of consumer goods and other services as well, are so integrated globally, and also thinking not simply about the kind of flows of goods that within those value chains, but also the people that are required to make those flows happen, is really what we're looking at as one of the key factors in each of these scenarios. The other is the different government's capacity on the healthcare front, but also across the other basic functions of government, including law and order, which is coming to be a factor in certain countries, particularly in Latin America, and we've had a lot of concern from clients in Africa on that as well. And then the last kind of main impact is around global coordination and the effectiveness of measures, not only public health measures that are taken, but also economic measures taken to mitigate the economic impacts. the scenario that we're looking at, that we're in at present, is the seasonal pandemic scenario, and I will say more on that in a moment. But I just wanted to say that the purpose of looking at this scenario analysis and why we've been doing this since February is to help organizations monitor where they feel the situation is going and what the implications are going to be on their organizations, as well as the communities with which they're involved, and taking actions to prepare for how things may change. So they're not necessarily meant to be exact depictions of possible futures. These are really kind of plausible scenarios based on the triggers and indicators that we're monitoring on a daily basis. It seems the seasonal pandemic scenario that we're in at the moment, I will come on to that shortly. Obviously, that has very deep impacts on communities, on the economy, and on people's daily lives. But it could conceivably get worse, and I think I just want to highlight under those other two scenarios, the uneven outbreaks and the prolonged pandemic. Prolonged pandemic is really a kind of worst case downside scenario, where we see the global economy just completely seize up, enter a long lasting recession. We're not there, and we don't think we will be moving there. But some of the key triggers that we're watching are looking at disruption to supply chains outside of China. This is really where I think the resilience and supply chain management of large multinationals own businesses can have much broader social impacts, and also is attracting and likely to increasingly attract regulatory attention. So questions of what's likely to get nationalized, what kind of, typically what we would classify as political risks in terms of direct state interventions in business, we've seen on a scale, speaking for the UK, that we never expected we would see, and certainly not from a Conservative government. So the political dial and rulebook has just gone out the window, really, in the last 2 weeks, as governments are really looking to be as pragmatic and creative and as innovative as they need to be able to respond to this. For the global economy, the kind of economic, just one point I would make on this is, historically speaking, if you look at recessions that have had lasting impacts on the economic recovery, usually they have lasted for an extended period of time, so longer than 1 to 2 quarters. At the moment, we expect that probably the recession will be a kind of 1 to 2 quarter event, and won't have that lasting impact through people just leaving the labor force altogether, or being demoralized, or bankruptcies of companies. But if it does roll on, you will get a snowball effect in terms of the economic impacts through some of those factors that I mentioned. I think the big uncertainty in all the economic modeling that's been done is what happens in terms of the evolution of the virus itself and the behavior of the virus itself. I should say that we work very closely with Oxford Economics on the economic forecasting side, and they're doing some excellent work on this at the moment. So please, if this is of interest to you particularly, I'm happy to give some good resources to suggest as a follow-up. The other issues that we're watching out for are the impacts on security environment. As I mentioned, this is particularly in developing countries, where we've seen concerns around xenophobia, violence against certain groups, as well as the impact that sudden layoffs, closures of facilities can have, shutdowns of transport, etc. I think the volatility in the security environment that's already there can be quite significantly affected. However, there are security issues that may affect more developed countries as well. So we've seen cases of organized crime getting involved in smuggling of supplies, face masks, hand sanitizer, etc., diversion of certain products to black market as well as the impact of everyone working remotely, and the challenges that this throws up for information security and the vulnerabilities to cyber threat actors. Personally speaking, I've already had 3 phishing attempts in this week linked to coronavirus. So that is something that for businesses need to be particularly mindful of at the moment as well. I think the most worrying trends that we are looking for, but we're very far away from in terms of what a prolonged pandemic and the impacts it would be if we see the postponement indefinitely of international and multilateral meetings, where we just see a kind of breakdown in the system that's there for international coordination and cooperation. As I said, we're very far from that. It's only really the kind of social sporting events that have been postponed and even then not indefinitely. Migration driven by public health concerns is something that is again plausible, but again not on the cards now, but would certainly be a much more severe impact. As well as having kind of widespread nationwide restrictions on freedom of movement. A lot of those have come in countries where they're experiencing the outbreak now, but if that cannot be controlled and that basically becomes a new normal situation, it will have significant changes for how companies need to operate, and obviously all of their employees, and the implications for our own daily lives as well. I'll just talk a little bit more about the current scenario, and this is where we've really seen the epicenter of the outbreak moving from China to Europe and the US, and kind of things gaining pace again in Asia Pacific outside of China. So in the past week, we've seen over 10% increases in cases reported in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Philippines, Malaysia, where they had been having a kind of flatter curve. We've seen that escalate in the past week. So the types of actions, we've been monitoring government's actions under this scenario since February. And I can tell you, when we started listing out all of the countries who had taken coronavirus restrictions, that list has just got longer and longer and longer. And we're looking at things like school closures, other social distancing measures, transit restrictions, international travel, mainly air travel, domestic travel, use of public transport, etc. If you look at Europe, this is pretty much all red now on almost all of these indicators, and every country in Europe. If you look at the US, I think that's changing quickly, but it's much patchier, and I'm sure as you all know, it also varies significantly by state. So that dislocation between the kind of federal level and the state level responses has been particularly notable, I think, in the US, and that also speaks to the state of the political system and the kind of relations between leaders in Washington and President Trump and those who are managing the state's responses. We're expecting the disruption that we've seen in production and supply chains to continue into the kind of late in Q2, so really into late June, with recovery really only starting in Q3. However, operating under that assumption, which is what most of our clients are doing, it does mean that planning for recovery needs to start a lot sooner than that. So thinking about how you bring your workforce back online, how you bring your business back online in different geographies is something that we're already seeing that in China. We're seeing that plans being made for that in Asia Pacific, and we think probably in the next 2 to 3 weeks it will be similar in Europe as well. If we're looking at the supply chains overall, it doesn't seem like we will have a kind of lasting dislocation. Maybe about 10 to 15%. There will be permanent changes where some companies have opted to permanently move out of China, for example, we've worked with some clients who've taken a decision really to exit a market based on how they've been affected by this crisis. I've just noted the time, and I realise I really need to speed
I was going to
up.
say,
Or yeah, I'm just going to move
keen
to my
get
last
some
slide.
questions in. Yeah.
I won't talk through this, but I'm happy to talk a little bit about the considerations in the UK in particular. But I should open up to questions now. Thanks, Robert.
That's very kind. Thank you. And sorry to interrupt there. We've got some very good questions. Wondered if, because you started to talk about them, but clearly people are interested in developing. One is titled skill fade. The question is, how do we counter the skill fade many employees will face? They will not be doing their job for quite some while, and sort of air traffic controllers. And how can we sort of counter that? What's your thought?
Yeah, it's a really difficult issue. I hadn't actually thought of air traffic controllers, but that's a really good example to throw up. I think for companies, they're doing the best they can with people who can remain engaged remotely. And I think for the UK response, actually a lot of the government's measures have been taken with this in mind, with ensuring when you have a kind of a shock like this. The reason I say it's more like a natural disaster is that it's catastrophic, and it affects everybody, almost totally equally, but you will recover from it. And I think that's where we are. What the government's response has been is to try to ensure that when the recovery comes and when everyone can go back to work, that we haven't permanently lost people from the labor force. And so the measures that they've put in place around supporting wages and ensuring that employment holds up is so that supply side of the economy is there and ready to work. The question of losing vital skills is something that I think is being wrestled with by pretty much all organizations, but especially for those critical national infrastructure is particularly challenging, because you can do a degree of remote learning. A lot of companies are doing online learning and virtual engagement, where people have those facilities, but in many cases they won't have had those set up. So I think we are likely to see, even in a 1 quarter kind of activity being written off, we are likely to see that things will take longer to come back than they would from any other type of shock, because there is going to be that degree of lost time, lost activity.
Thank you. The Civil Contingencies Act in the UK, dated 2004. Resilience First have long argued that it needs review, and perhaps this has precipitated a review of that. What's your view on that sort of government contingency legislation?
That is a good question, and to be honest, I haven't had a chance to look at this morning. It was on my list.
No, that's fine.
But it's just been one of well, every day feels like that at the moment.
No, that's fine.
So we have been having a discussion around what this means specifically on the kind of the government's legislative agenda once we get through this phase of emergency measures. But I wish I could give you. I wish I had an answer.
Let me try this one. Is this the end of cash?
Oh, I mean, for me it is. I don't know how other people, I guess everyone's taking a personal view on that. It definitely seems to have boosted, for the online payment providers, payment processors. If you look at the stocks that have performed well and quite poorly, those are some of the ones who've were already, kind of growing quite well and had no issues kind of raising funds, but they've really benefited from this period of volatility. I think it's going to play out quite differently culturally. So probably in places where cash was already on the decline, you would see that. So I think in recent years, online payments, cashless payments were growing at a faster rate, but cash until recently, even in UK and Western Europe, cash as a kind of good in terms of the companies printing it, doing the secure printing of it, they were still growing at about 4% a year. I think this will make certain markets just put that completely crush that. But from a central bank's point of view, I think they're highly reluctant, most central banks, to move to an entirely cashless system. Because the level of kind of sophistication that you need within society, as well as those who will really find it very difficult to move to an entirely cashless system, is still quite significant. So I don't think it's the end of cash everywhere, but probably in some places. I wouldn't expect to see the kind of growth that we had seen in recent years.
Oh, okay. Another question from a participant is your points about global governance, and John addressed this as well. Do you think the WHO has come out of this, or will come out of this well, or will it require radical change? And like all UN institutions, require some degree of compunction and legitimacy behind it?
It's a really good question. I think, as with all UN institutions, and the WHO less so because it has such technical mandate, but all of the international institutions really are kind of a function of their members and how committed their member countries are, and the resources that they put behind it, and the standards of accountability that they exercise. And I think I am sure that we will see post-COVID calls for a strategic review of the response, how it could have been managed, lessons learned from it. I think it's very unlikely that we see kind of finger pointing at the WHO as an institution in terms of its responsibility, because its responsibility is not to intervene, in the public health responses of its members, but it's to set the guidance and the policy, and to do the analysis and the research, and make sure that the kind of public good side of that is managed well. So I'm sure we're likely to see that kind of review. I think what is of more concern is the kind of lack of global political leadership, because where we've seen coordination work well, it's been on the monetary side between central banks, and we haven't really seen that, even to a degree within the EU in terms of the fiscal packages that European countries have taken out. And that's partly because events have just moved so quickly that the global system is not set up to take decisions and consult around that quickly. So I think we are likely to see much more unevenness, I think, in how those reform, a review happens, and I'm sure some reforms will be enacted. But I would say I'm probably more pessimistic on that being consistent at a global level.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to draw the session to a close. It's been fascinating, and I'm really grateful to Eugene John, who sadly disappeared from the screen, but very grateful. The question that has come up repeatedly is, can we share your slides together with John's post this event? Is that possible?
Yes, certainly.
That's very kind indeed. So I'll just leave to thank both speakers again. Please do look at our website for future webinars and activities. And I do hope you can join us again through this means, which we now have a better understanding of its operation. So thank you very much for your time, and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.